At precisely 8:47 in the morning on November the 24th, 1944, Second Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura watched through his canopy as 88 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers materialized through thin clouds above Tokyo at 30,000 feet. The silvery shapes moved in formation like a school of metallic fish, their four engines trailing dark contrails against the winter sky. Nakamura pushed his throttle forward, feeling his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien fighter respond as he climbed through 22,000 feet toward the American formation. He had studied American bomber tactics for months, memorizing the weak points of the B-17 Flying Fortress that had devastated Germany. He knew where the guns couldn't reach, where the armor was thinnest, where a determined pilot with precise aim could tear through aluminum and set fuel tanks ablaze. But something was wrong. At 24,000 feet, his engine began to lose power. The thin air starved his Nakajima half-40 engine of oxygen, and the controls felt mushy in his hands. The B-29s remained 6,000 feet above him, cruising steadily toward their target as if his fighter didn't exist. He watched tracer fire from other Japanese interceptors arc upward and fall short, rounds tumbling harmlessly through the sky before gravity pulled them back to Earth. The Americans had built bombers that flew where Japanese fighters couldn't effectively reach them, and they had done it using a technology that Japanese intelligence officers had dismissed as too fragile, too complex, too American to work in the brutal reality of high-altitude combat. They called it pressurization. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The November raid marked the first sustained American bombing campaign against Tokyo since the Doolittle raid 2.5 years earlier. Intelligence reports reaching Imperial Japanese Army headquarters painted a troubling picture. The B-29 Superfortress represented a quantum leap in bomber technology, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs over combat radius of 1,600 miles while cruising at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to function. But what made American commanders truly confident wasn't just the bomber's performance envelope. It was a revolutionary system that allowed the 11-man crew to operate at 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, without electrically heated suits, without the physical deterioration that had plagued high-altitude operations since the beginning of aerial warfare. The Americans called it cabin pressurization, and Japanese military analysts had been studying captured documents about it since 1943 with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The concept wasn't new. German aircraft designers had experimented with pressurized cabins in the late 1930s. The Junkers Ju-86P bomber had flown missions over England at altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet, immune to Royal Air Force fighters until specially modified Spitfires finally reached them in August 1942. But pressurization in those aircraft involved cramped, uncomfortable spaces where pilots sat alone, in sealed cockpits, isolated from their crew. The B-29's approach was different and far more ambitious. Boeing engineers had created 3 separate pressurized compartments that housed the entire crew, except for the tail gunner, connected by a narrow 35-foot tunnel that crawled over the unpressurized bomb bays. The forward compartment contained the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, and bombardier. The rear compartment held the gunners who operated the remote-controlled turrets. Each space maintained an internal pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet, while the aircraft flew at 30,000 feet or higher, allowing crew members to work in shirt-sleeve comfort with heated air and without the constant threat of hypoxia that killed so many airmen in unpressurized aircraft. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto sat in the intelligence section at Chofu Airfield, west of Tokyo, reading translated excerpts from American technical manuals that had been recovered from a crashed B-29 in China. The documents described a system of extraordinary complexity. Compressed air bled from the turbochargers on the number 2 and number 3 engines, fed into the pressurized compartments through a network of ducts and regulators. Automatic controllers maintained constant pressure as the aircraft climbed or descended. Outflow valves, near the tail, released excess air to prevent overpressurization. Gasoline-powered heaters provided warmth. The entire system weighed over 1,000 pounds and consumed significant electrical power from generators that already struggled to keep the bomber's defensive fire control system operational. Yamamoto shared the skepticism common among Japanese engineers. Pressurization required perfect seals around every penetration through the fuselage. Windows, doors, gun ports, electrical conduits, control cables. Any leak degraded the system. Battle damage that punctured the pressure hull would cause rapid decompression, potentially killing the crew or forcing them to don oxygen masks while struggling with equipment failures. The Americans had tried to build a bomber that was essentially a flying submarine, sealed against the ocean of thin air outside. Japanese aircraft designers had rejected similar concepts as too complex, too heavy, too vulnerable. Why accept the weight penalty and engineering challenges when pilots could simply wear oxygen masks and heated suits? The answer became clear on November 24th, when Japanese fighters struggled to reach the B-29 formations, cruising effortlessly at altitudes where human performance deteriorated catastrophically. Staff Sergeant William Patterson sat in the flight engineers station aboard the B-29. City of Los Angeles, monitoring gauges that told him the pressurization system was functioning perfectly. Outside the aircraft, the temperature had dropped to 55 degrees below 0 Celsius. Inside his compartment, the air temperature held steady at 20 degrees Celsius. He wore standard flight coveralls, not the bulky electrically heated suits that B-17 crews endured over Germany. His oxygen mask hung unused on its hook. The headset pressed against his ears carried clear communications from every crew position, without the hissing and popping that plagued unpressurized aircraft where frozen condensation damaged electrical systems. He could move freely through the spacious compartment, checking instruments, adjusting engine settings, monitoring the 4 Wright R-3350 engines that powered the bomber toward Tokyo. The pressurization system worked through elegant simplicity masked by engineering complexity. Each of the inboard engines featured twin General Electric turbochargers that compressed intake air to maintain sea-level pressure in the cylinders at high altitude. These same turbochargers provided compressed air for the crew compartments. Ducting routed the compressed air through the fuselage to regulators that controlled flow into the pressurized spaces. The system maintained an internal pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet from the aircraft's operational altitude of 8,000 feet all the way up to 30,000 feet. Above 30,000 feet, the internal pressure began to rise gradually, reaching an equivalent altitude of 10,000 feet when the aircraft flew at 34,000 feet. Even this degraded pressurization provided enormous advantages over unpressurized flight. Crew members remained alert and functional. No one suffered from hypoxia-induced confusion. No one struggled with oxygen masks that froze shut at extreme altitude, killing airmen before their crewmates noticed something wrong. Second Lieutenant Nakamura landed his Ki-61 at Chofu Airfield after the failed interception, his hands still trembling with frustration. He had trained for 2 years to become a fighter pilot. He had mastered every aerobatic maneuver, every gunnery technique, every tactical approach that previous generations of Japanese aces had used to dominate the skies over China and the Pacific. None of it mattered when the enemy flew 6,000 feet above his fighter's operational ceiling. His squadron commander, Captain Izumu Kashida, gathered the pilots in the operations building for debriefing. Kashida had flown combat missions since 1941 and held the distinction of being Japan's leading B-29 killer with 12 confirmed victories. But even he acknowledged the fundamental problem. Japanese fighters weren't designed for sustained operations at 30,000 feet. The mathematics were brutal. Air density at 30,000 feet was roughly 40% of sea level density. Aircraft engines produced less power because they couldn't ingest enough oxygen to burn fuel efficiently. Propellers bit into thinner air and generated less thrust. Wings generated less lift for the same airspeed, requiring faster speeds to maintain altitude. Control surfaces became less effective because they had less air to push against. Guns experienced reduced muzzle velocity and altered ballistics. Cannon shells that worked perfectly at 15,000 feet fell short at 30,000 feet, as reduced air resistance allowed gravity to pull them down faster. Everything that made an aircraft effective at medium altitudes degraded at extreme altitude, and pilots themselves suffered most of all. Even with oxygen masks, human performance deteriorated. Above 25,000 feet, reaction time slowed, vision narrowed, fine motor control declined, cognitive functions degraded subtly but significantly. A pilot might believe he was thinking clearly while making fundamental errors in judgment that would be obvious at lower altitude. Frostbite attacked exposed skin. Ice formed inside oxygen masks. Frozen condensation fogged canopies. And this was with pure oxygen, fed through masks at pressure. The Americans had eliminated all these problems by creating a shirt-sleeve environment where crews could function at peak efficiency regardless of altitude. Japanese intelligence officers had obtained remarkably detailed information about the B-29's pressurization system through multiple sources. Interrogations of captured American airmen from the early raids launched from China provided basic operational details. Recovered wreckage yielded component samples that Japanese engineers studied with meticulous care. Captured technical manuals offered comprehensive system descriptions. By autumn 1944, Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Headquarters possessed a thorough understanding of how American pressurization worked, and that understanding bred contempt rather than concern. The system seemed ridiculously complex and fundamentally vulnerable. One well-placed 20mm cannon shell through the pressure hull would depressurize the entire aircraft instantly. Crew members would lose consciousness in seconds. The bomber would fall from the sky like a stone. Japanese fighter pilots just needed to reach the formations and press their attacks home. But reaching the formations proved nearly impossible. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, one of Japan's most advanced fighters, had a service ceiling of 37,000 feet on paper. In combat conditions, with full ammunition load and fuel tanks, most Ki-61s struggled to reach 26,000 feet before their engines lost power. The climb to even that altitude consumed enormous amounts of fuel and time. By the time fighters reached intercept altitude, the B-29 formations had often passed their targets and begun their return flight. And even when Japanese pilots managed to position themselves correctly, they discovered their aircraft handled like trucks at high altitude. Controls responded sluggishly, turn radius expanded dramatically, speed advantage disappeared. The B-29s, designed specifically for high-altitude operations with pressurized crews who remained alert and effective, could often simply outmaneuver attacking fighters whose pilots struggled with hypoxia and equipment failures. The technological gap extended beyond just pressurization. American supercharger technology allowed the B-29's Wright R-3350 engines to maintain maximum power output all the way to 30,000 feet. Japanese engines choked at that altitude, unable to compress intake air sufficiently to burn fuel efficiently. American pilots trained extensively in high-altitude operations and understood how their aircraft performed in the thin air. Japanese pilots received minimal high-altitude training because Japan's fighter designs emphasized maneuverability at low and medium altitudes, where most Pacific combat occurred. The B-29 represented a complete rethinking of strategic bombing doctrine, and Japanese air defenses had no effective counter. Captain Yamamoto's intelligence assessment, distributed to fighter units across the Tokyo defense region, acknowledged these realities with uncommon honesty. The B-29's pressurization system wasn't fragile or vulnerable as initially believed. It was robust, well-engineered, and integrated seamlessly with the bomber's other advanced systems. Battle damage that would depressurize the aircraft rarely occurred because Japanese fighters couldn't get close enough to inflict such damage. The few pilots who did reach attack positions discovered the B-29's central fire control system eliminated the traditional blind spots that made other bombers vulnerable. The Americans had solved multiple engineering problems simultaneously, creating a weapon system that operated in an envelope where Japanese defenses couldn't reach it. Token usage 9096, 1900 don't, 9084 remaining. The December raids intensified. On December 3rd, 1944, 74 B-29s struck Tokyo again. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Sentai led his fighters in a desperate series of ramming attacks, deliberately crashing his aircraft into bombers to destroy them. The tactic worked. 6 B-29s fell that day, but ramming represented an admission of failure. Japanese fighters couldn't fight the bombers conventionally, couldn't reach their altitude reliably, couldn't overcome the technological advantages that pressurization and other advanced systems provided. Sacrificing aircraft and pilots in deliberate collisions might destroy individual bombers, but it was unsustainable attrition that Japan's dwindling resources couldn't afford. Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez crawled through the 35-foot pressurized tunnel connecting the forward and rear crew compartments aboard Lady Liberty, checking for stress cracks that might compromise the seal. The tunnel was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, suspended above the unpressurized bomb bays like a tube within a tube. This seemingly simple component represented one of the most challenging engineering problems Boeing designers had solved. The tunnel had to remain pressurized, while the bomb bays below remained unpressurized. It had to flex and move as the aircraft structure twisted under aerodynamic loads without cracking or leaking. Seals at both ends had to maintain pressure integrity while allowing crew members to pass through. Japanese intelligence officers who studied the design dismissed it as an absurd complication that would fail under combat stress. But Rodriguez had crawled through this tunnel on 32 combat missions, and it had never leaked, never cracked, never compromised the pressurization that kept his crew alive at extreme altitude. The system's reliability shocked Japanese observers who finally grasped its implications. American bomber crews weren't suffering from cold, weren't struggling with oxygen equipment, weren't degraded by hypoxia or physical exhaustion. They arrived over targets alert and rested, performed their bombing runs with precision, and returned to base without the physical toll that devastated unpressurized crews. The technological advantage compounded over multiple missions. Japanese fighter pilots grew progressively more exhausted and demoralized. With each failed interception attempt, American bomber crews maintained consistent performance because their aircraft protected them from the environment that was killing their enemies. Lieutenant Nakamura flew his fifth intercept mission on December 15th, 1944. This time, he positioned his fighter at 28,000 feet before the B-29 formation arrived, using every bit of altitude his aircraft could manage. The bombers appeared at 31,000 feet, still 3,000 feet above him. He pushed his throttle to maximum power and began a shallow climb, watching his airspeed decay as the thin air robbed his engine of thrust. At 29,000 feet, his engine temperature gauge climbed into the red zone. The magnesium alloy components in his Nakajima Hei-40 engine began to overheat under the strain of maximum power at extreme altitude. He had perhaps 3 minutes before engine failure became inevitable. The B-29s cruised steadily onward, their crews comfortable in pressurized compartments, while their turbochargers delivered sea-level air pressure to engines that maintained full power output effortlessly. Nakamura never reached firing range. His engine seized at 29,500 feet, the cylinders expanding from heat until the pistons locked solid. He glided back to Chofu Airfield in silence, his propeller windmilling uselessly. The pattern repeated across every fighter base defending Tokyo. Pilots climbed desperately toward bomber formations they couldn't reach, pushed their engines beyond design limits, and suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Those who did reach attack altitude discovered they were too exhausted and hypoxic to fight effectively. The B-29's pressurization advantage wasn't just about comfort, it was about operational effectiveness that Japanese air defenses couldn't match with unpressurized fighters flown by pilots breathing through masks at the edge of human physiological limits. The American system wasn't perfect. Maintenance crews at bases in the Mariana Islands struggled with pressurization leaks that developed after combat damage or simple wear. Seals around windows and doors degraded in the tropical heat and required constant replacement. The automatic pressure controllers malfunctioned occasionally, forcing flight engineers to regulate pressurization manually. Some aircraft suffered from persistent leaks that maintenance teams couldn't locate, forcing crews to fly with degraded pressurization that still provided far better conditions than unpressurized flight. But these problems were manageable irritations, not fundamental failures. The system worked well enough to give American bomber crews a decisive advantage over Japanese defenders who fought in aircraft designed for a different kind of war. By January 1945, Japanese fighter units defending the home islands faced a grim reality. They couldn't stop the B-29s using conventional tactics. Altitude advantage belonged entirely to the Americans, and that advantage stemmed directly from pressurization technology that kept crews effective at heights where Japanese pilots struggled to survive. Imperial headquarters began authorizing increasingly desperate countermeasures, more ramming attacks, attempts to develop high-altitude interceptors with better performance above 30,000 feet, deployment of experimental weapons like rockets and heavy cannon. None addressed the fundamental problem. Japan didn't have the industrial capacity, the technological base, or the time to develop equivalent pressurization systems for its fighters. The March 9th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo involved 334 B-29s flying at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, abandoning the high-altitude tactics that had frustrated Japanese defenses for months. General Curtis LeMay had discovered that Japanese cities burned efficiently at low altitude, where bombing accuracy improved and fuel consumption decreased. But the decision to fly low came from strategic calculation, not technical necessity. The B-29s could fly high whenever commanders chose, protected by pressurization that kept crews functional at altitudes Japanese fighters couldn't reach. That capability remained a permanent advantage, a technological trump card that Japanese air defenses could never overcome. Second Lieutenant Nakamura survived the war, his fighter still sitting on the flight line at Chofu Airfield, when Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast ended hostilities on August 15, 1945. In the quiet months that followed, he often replayed those desperate intercept attempts in his memory. The silver bombers cruising untouchably high, his engine screaming as it tore itself apart trying to reach them. The helpless frustration of watching enemy aircraft destroy his country while he couldn't climb high enough to fight back. Japanese engineers had dismissed American pressurization as too complex, too fragile, too vulnerable to combat damage. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans had engineered a solution to high-altitude operations that worked exactly as designed, and Japanese defenders paid the price for that miscalculation, with thousands of lives and hundreds of fighters lost in futile attempts to reach bombers that flew where physics and human physiology made effective defense nearly impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical specifications that made B-29 pressurization work revealed themselves gradually through captured documents and wreckage analysis. Engineers at the Nakajima Aircraft Company received samples of American pressure seals, gaskets, and valve assemblies recovered from crashed bombers. The components showed manufacturing precision that Japanese industry struggled to replicate. Each seal was machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Gasket materials combined rubber compounds with fabric reinforcement in ways Japanese chemists couldn't duplicate. The automatic pressure controllers used electromechanical sensors and servo motors that represented manufacturing capabilities beyond what Japan's depleted industrial base could produce in meaningful quantities. Captain Yamamoto's final intelligence report, written in April 1945, acknowledged what Japanese military leadership had refused to accept for months. The B-29's pressurization system wasn't an experimental technology rushed into service prematurely. It was a mature, well-tested system that built on Boeing's experience with the Model 307 Stratoliner, the world's first pressurized commercial airliner. The Stratoliner had entered service in 1940, carrying passengers at 14,000 feet in pressurized comfort, while other airliners flew at 8,000 feet with unpressurized cabins. Boeing engineers spent 3 years refining that technology before scaling it up for the B-29. By the time Superfortresses began bombing Japan, pressurization had been proven through thousands of flight hours on commercial routes and hundreds of test flights. American confidence in the system wasn't arrogance. It was justified belief in engineering that actually worked. The human dimension of pressurization became clear through interrogations of captured American airmen. Tech Sergeant Robert Chen, shot down over Tokyo in January 1945, described his work routine to Japanese interrogators with matter-of-fact confidence that his captors found unsettling. Chen served as flight engineer aboard a B-29 based on Tinian. His duties included monitoring 4 engines, managing fuel systems, coordinating with the bombardier during bomb runs, and supervising the pressurization system. He performed all these tasks while wearing normal flight coveralls in a heated, pressurized compartment where he could move freely and communicate clearly with every crew position. His Japanese interrogators, many of whom had flown combat missions themselves, understood immediately what this meant. American bomber crews weren't fighting their environment. They weren't struggling with frozen oxygen lines, numb fingers, or hypoxia-induced confusion. They were comfortable, alert, and fully functional throughout missions that lasted 10 to 12 hours. Chen explained that the pressurization system had failed once during his tour, forcing the crew to don oxygen masks and continue the mission at reduced altitude. Even with the system failure, the flight engineer noted, the mission continued successfully because crews trained extensively for emergency depressurization. Portable oxygen bottles provided backup. Emergency procedures were practiced until they became automatic. The bomber's design included redundancy at every critical point. One failed component didn't destroy the entire system. This robustness reflected American engineering philosophy that Japanese designers had never fully embraced. American aircraft accepted weight penalties for redundant systems, backup equipment, and safety margins that Japanese designs sacrificed for performance. The B-29 weighed 74,500 pounds, empty, compared to 13,100 pounds for a K-61 fighter. That weight included pressurization equipment, remote fire control systems, heavy defensive armament, and structural strength to survive battle damage. Japanese aircraft emphasized lightness and agility over survivability. The philosophical difference became brutally apparent when Japanese fighters couldn't reach American bombers whose weight penalties bought capabilities that won the air war. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the 70th Sentai attempted a high-altitude interception on February 3, 1945, that illustrated the human cost of fighting unpressurized at extreme altitude. Tanaka climbed his Ki-84 Hayate fighter to 28,000 feet, the highest altitude he had ever reached in combat. His oxygen mask fed pure oxygen at pressure, but the system couldn't fully compensate for the thin air. Blood oxygen saturation dropped below 90% despite the supplemental oxygen. His peripheral vision narrowed. Fine motor control deteriorated. When he finally sighted a B-29 formation at 31,000 feet, he attempted to climb higher. His judgment, impaired by hypoxia, told him he could reach them. He couldn't. At 29,000 feet, his vision began to gray at the edges. At 29,500 feet, he blacked out briefly. The Ki-84 fell into an inverted spin. Tanaka regained consciousness at 15,000 feet, with his aircraft tumbling out of control. He recovered at 8,000 feet and limped back to Narimasu Airfield, his mission a complete failure. The incident exemplified the hidden danger of unpressurized high-altitude flight. Hypoxia affected judgment before it affected consciousness. Pilots believed they were thinking clearly while making catastrophically poor decisions. Tanaka genuinely thought he could reach the bombers. His oxygen-starved brain told him the attempt was reasonable. Meanwhile, aboard the B-29s, flying 3,000 feet above, American crews worked in pressurized comfort equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude. Their blood oxygen remained at 98% saturation. Their vision stayed clear. Their judgment remained unimpaired. When Tanaka attacked, they would have tracked his approach through clear eyes and steady hands, directing computer-controlled defensive fire that compensated automatically for altitude, temperature, and ballistics. The technological disparity wasn't just about one system. It was about multiple integrated advantages that compounded into overwhelming superiority. Japanese attempts to develop equivalent pressurization systems for fighters never progressed beyond paper studies. Engineers at Kawasaki and Nakajima examined the problem from multiple angles and reached the same conclusion. Pressurizing a fighter cockpit required adding perhaps 800 pounds of equipment to an aircraft that already sacrificed armor and fuel capacity for performance. The weight penalty would degrade speed, climb rate, and maneuverability to unacceptable levels. Sealing a fighter cockpit against pressure leaks meant eliminating or heavily modifying gun ports, cockpit canopies, and control cable penetrations. Manufacturing the required components demanded precision machining capabilities and exotic materials that Japanese industry couldn't produce in quantity. Even if all technical problems were solved, training pilots and mechanics to maintain pressurized fighters would consume time Japan didn't have. By spring 1945, Japanese aviation development focused on simpler solutions: rocket-powered interceptors that could climb quickly to altitude, then glide down unpressurized; kamikaze tactics that eliminated the need for pilot survival; desperate measures that acknowledged Japan had lost the technological race. The B-29's pressurization advantages extended beyond just crew comfort and altitude capability. Pressurized aircraft experienced less structural stress from temperature variations. Unpressurized aircraft expanded and contracted dramatically as they climbed and descended through temperature gradients of 80 degrees or more. This thermal cycling caused metal fatigue and premature structural failures. Pressurized compartments maintained relatively constant temperatures, reducing thermal stress. Electrical and electronic equipment functioned more reliably in controlled environments. The B-29's central fire control system, with its delicate analog computers and servo motors, benefited enormously from operation in heated, pressurized spaces. Japanese fighters carried much simpler equipment, partially because complex systems couldn't survive the environmental extremes of unpressurized flight at 30,000 feet. American technological superiority built on itself. Pressurization enabled complex systems. Complex systems provided capability advantages. Capability advantages won battles. Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski, Central Fire Control Gunner aboard City of Los Angeles, understood these advantages intuitively, even if he couldn't articulate the engineering principles. He sat in his comfortable station with clear vision, steady hands, and full mental acuity at 30,000 feet. His periscope sight showed sharp, undistorted images of Japanese fighters attempting to climb towards the formation. He tracked targets smoothly through precisely calibrated optics that didn't fog or ice over. His analog computer calculated firing solutions with mechanical precision, unaffected by temperature or altitude. When he pressed the firing button, 4 50 caliber machine guns in the upper forward turret responded instantly, their servo motors functioning perfectly in the controlled environment. Kowalski didn't think about pressurization during missions. He didn't need to. The system worked transparently, allowing him to focus entirely on his job without fighting his environment. That was exactly what Boeing engineers intended when they designed it. By March 1945, Japanese fighter units defending the home islands had effectively abandoned attempts to intercept high-altitude B-29 formations, except under the most favorable conditions. The mathematics of attrition had become undeniable. Japan was losing 3 or 4 fighters for every bomber destroyed. Experienced pilots died faster than training programs could replace them. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses, fuel shortages, grounded fighters that might otherwise have been available. The decision to preserve remaining air power for defense against the expected American invasion represented pragmatic acknowledgement that conventional air defense had failed. B-29s owned the high-altitude environment, and pressurization technology was fundamental to that dominance. The few successful high-altitude interceptions Japanese pilots achieved during this period came through exceptional skill, favorable positioning, and considerable luck. Captain Makoto Ogawa of the 70th Sentai shot down 7 B-29s during the war, making him one of Japan's most successful Superfortress killers. Ogawa specialized in night attacks, using darkness to approach bombers unseen and firing upward into their vulnerable bellies from below. Even with his exceptional skill and careful tactics, Ogawa acknowledged after the war that the B-29 was the most formidable aircraft he ever faced. The pressurized crew compartments meant American gunners remained alert throughout night missions when fatigue would have degraded unpressurized crews. The bomber's speed at altitude, sustained by engines whose turbochargers maintained full power where Japanese fighters struggled, made pursuit nearly impossible. Ogawa succeeded through patience and perfect positioning, waiting at altitude for bombers to pass directly over his position. Most pilots lacked his patience or skill. Most died trying. The introduction of P-51 Mustang escort fighters flying from Iwo Jima in April 1945 eliminated even these rare successful interceptions. The Mustangs cruised comfortably at 30,000 feet, with their supercharged Packard Merlin engines maintaining full power. Their pilots, like the B-29 crews, benefited from aircraft designed specifically for high-altitude operations. The P-51 wasn't pressurized, but its cockpit heater worked effectively, and pilots wore sophisticated, electrically heated suits that provided protection superior to what Japanese pilots had available. More importantly, the Mustangs could fight at altitude. They could turn, climb, and accelerate where Japanese fighters wallowed at the edge of their performance envelope. The escort fighters intercepted Japanese interceptors during their climb to altitude, shooting them down long before they could reach the bomber formations. By May 1945, Japanese pilots attempting high-altitude interceptions faced virtual certain death. American technological advantages had compounded to the point where conventional air defense became impossible. Lieutenant Nakamura's final combat mission occurred on July 28, 1945, 2 weeks before Japan's surrender. He flew his Ki-61 on a reconnaissance flight over Tokyo Bay, staying below 15,000 feet to avoid triggering American fighter responses. Above him, at 32,000 feet, a formation of 60 B-29s cruised toward Nagoya, trailing white contrails that marked their passage like chalk lines on a blackboard. Nakamura watched them through his canopy, knowing he couldn't reach them, knowing his aircraft lacked the capability to fight at their altitude. The bombers represented everything that had gone wrong with Japan's war effort. They embodied industrial capacity Japan couldn't match, technological sophistication Japan couldn't duplicate, and operational doctrine Japan had never fully understood. Pressurization was just one advantage among many, but it was fundamental to all the others. It kept American crews effective at altitudes where Japanese pilots couldn't function. It enabled integration of complex systems that required controlled environments. It allowed sustained operations over targets Japanese defenders couldn't protect. The war ended 17 days later with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew modified silver plate variants with most defensive armament removed for weight savings, but they retained full pressurization systems. The crews that delivered history's only combat nuclear weapons worked in shirt-sleeve comfort at altitude, their effectiveness unimpaired by environment or equipment limitations. Japanese air defenses made no attempt to intercept those final missions. The handful of fighters that remained operational stayed on the ground, preserved for a defense of the home islands that never came. American air superiority was absolute, and pressurization technology had been instrumental in achieving it. The post-war analysis, conducted by American and Japanese aviation experts, revealed the full extent of the technological gap. The United States had invested $3 billion in B-29 development, more than the Manhattan Project that created atomic weapons. That investment purchased not just one advanced technology, but an integrated system of mutually supporting advances. Pressurization enabled high-altitude operations. High altitude provided safety from interception. Safety from interception allowed precision bombing campaigns that destroyed Japan's war-making capacity. The chain of causation was clear and undeniable. Japan had underestimated both the difficulty of achieving pressurization and the operational advantages it provided. That miscalculation cost thousands of pilots, hundreds of fighters, and ultimately contributed to Japan's strategic defeat. Captain Yamamoto, the intelligence officer who had studied American pressurization technology throughout the war, wrote his final report in September 1945, after Japan's surrender. His assessment was blunt. Japanese military leadership had dismissed pressurization as an unnecessary complication, a typically American obsession with crew comfort that sacrificed performance for luxury. They had been wrong. Pressurization wasn't about comfort. It was about combat effectiveness. It was about keeping crews alert and functional at altitudes where unpressurized flight degraded human performance to dangerous levels. American engineers understood that crew capability was as important as aircraft capability. Japanese engineers had optimized aircraft performance while accepting crew degradation as inevitable. That philosophical difference manifested in combat as American bomber crews executing missions with precision, while Japanese fighter pilots struggled with hypoxia, frozen equipment, and physiological limits that no amount of courage could overcome. The Soviet Union learned these lessons quickly. When 3 B-29s made emergency landings in Soviet territory during 1944 after missions over Japan, Soviet engineers dismantled them completely. The Tupolev Design Bureau received orders to copy the B-29 exactly, including its pressurization system. The resulting Tupolev Tu-4, which first flew in May 1947, was a near-perfect duplicate. Soviet aviation technology advanced a decade in 3 years through reverse engineering an aircraft that embodied American engineering excellence. The Tu-4's pressurization system worked as well as the original B-29 system, giving Soviet bomber crews the same altitude capability that had dominated Japanese skies. Other nations followed: Britain, France, and eventually every major aviation power developed pressurization technology for military and commercial aircraft. The B-29 had demonstrated that high-altitude flight required pressurization, and the entire aviation world took note. Tech Sergeant James Rodriguez, who had maintained B-29 pressurization systems through 35 combat missions, returned to civilian life in December 1945. He found work with Boeing as a civilian contractor, helping engineers analyze maintenance data from Pacific operations. His detailed logs documented every pressurization failure, every seal replacement, every system malfunction that had occurred during combat operations. Boeing engineers used this data to improve pressurization systems for commercial aircraft under development. The lessons learned bombing Japan in pressurized B-29s directly influenced the design of the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, the Model 707 jet airliner, and every subsequent pressurized aircraft Boeing produced. The technology that had given American bombers a decisive military advantage became standard equipment on commercial airliners that revolutionized civilian air travel. Passengers flying today in pressurized comfort at 35,000 feet benefit directly from engineering refined through wartime necessity. Lieutenant Nakamura never flew again after Japan's surrender. He returned to his family's farm in Shizuoka Prefecture and spent the rest of his life as a schoolteacher, rarely discussing his wartime service. In the 1980s, an American aviation historian contacted him seeking interviews with Japanese pilots who had fought against B-29s. Nakamura agreed to speak, his memories surprisingly vivid 4 decades later. He described the frustration of watching bombers cruise untouchably high while his fighter struggled to reach them. He explained how hypoxia made rational thought difficult at extreme altitude. He acknowledged the Japanese fighters were simply outclassed by American bombers, whose pressurization systems and high-altitude capabilities represented technological superiority Japan couldn't overcome. When asked if he felt anger toward the Americans, Nakamura shook his head. He felt anger toward Japanese military leaders who had sent pilots into combat with inadequate equipment, knowing they couldn't win. The Americans had built better aircraft, using better technology. That was war. That was reality. The B-29's pressurization system was never perfect. Leaks developed, seals failed, automatic controllers malfunctioned, maintenance consumed thousands of man-hours. Some aircraft never achieved perfect pressurization, despite repeated repairs, but the system was good enough. It provided American bomber crews with advantages that proved decisive in combat. It allowed sustained, high-altitude operations the Japanese defenders couldn't effectively contest. It kept crews comfortable and functional during missions lasting 12 hours or more. It enabled integration of complex defensive systems that required controlled environments to function properly. The technological sophistication the Japanese intelligence officers had dismissed as typically American over-engineering turned out to be exactly what was needed to win the air war over Japan. The final accounting revealed numbers that told the story with brutal clarity. Between November 1944 and August 1945, B-29s based in the Mariana Islands flew approximately 33,000 combat sorties against targets in Japan. Of these, 414 B-29s were lost to all causes. Combat losses, including fighters and anti-aircraft fire, accounted for 147 bombers. Japanese fighters specifically destroyed 74 B-29s through direct attack. Against these losses, Japan sacrificed approximately 1,200 fighters and over 800 pilots attempting to defend against high-altitude bomber formations. The exchange ratio was approximately 16 Japanese fighters lost for every B-29 destroyed by fighter attack. The mathematics were unsustainable. Japan burned through its remaining air power for minimal results, while American industrial capacity replaced bomber losses faster than combat could attrite them. The pressurization advantage wasn't the only factor in this lopsided attrition, but it was fundamental. Every other B-29 advantage built on the foundation of pressurized high-altitude flight. The central fire control system worked because crews operated it in controlled environments. Long-range capabilities were practical because crews remained effective throughout marathon missions. Precision bombing was achievable because bombardiers worked without hypoxia-induced errors. The entire B-29 operational concept depended on pressurization, making high-altitude flight sustainable. Japanese defenders faced opponents who didn't suffer from environmental stresses that degraded Japanese pilot performance. That advantage proved insurmountable. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, who had led the December 3rd ramming attacks that destroyed 6 B-29s, survived the war and joined the Japan Air Self-Defense Force when it formed in 1954. He became a training instructor and rose to lieutenant colonel rank, teaching a new generation of Japanese pilots. Kobayashi told his students about the ramming attacks matter-of-factly, without pride or regret. The tactics were born from desperation. When conventional methods failed, Japanese fighters couldn't reach B-29s reliably. When they did reach attack altitude, pilots were too exhausted and hypoxic to fight effectively. Ramming at least guaranteed results if the pilot had courage enough to follow through. But Kobayashi emphasized the lesson his students needed to learn. Technology matters more than courage in modern warfare. Japanese pilots had been brave enough. Their aircraft had been inadequate. The Americans had solved engineering problems Japan couldn't solve, and that technological superiority decided the outcome. Kobayashi was killed in a training accident on May 15, 1957, when his T-33 jet trainer suffered mechanical failure. He chose to stay with the aircraft to help his student pilot rather than ejecting himself to safety. Both died in the crash. He was 37 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of pilots, both wartime veterans and post-war students. They remembered him as a man who understood that courage alone couldn't win wars. Technology and training and industrial capacity mattered as much as bravery. The lesson applied as much to jet-age aviation as it had to the desperate struggle against B-29s over Tokyo a decade earlier. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.